Hello and welcome to Business Africa, a very special 200th edition of this program. Thank you for marking it with us. Top stories this week. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to enter recession due to the coronavirus, according to World Bank forecasts. The International Monetary Fund to give emergency aid and relieve debt in African countries struggling to cope with the pandemic. And then the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, agrees to a record oil production cut, ending an oil price war. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to go into recession this year due to the coronavirus pandemic. This is according to a World Bank assessment of the impact of COVID-19 in this part of the continent. GDPs are expected to fall in Nigeria, Angola and South Africa, the three largest economies in Sub-Saharan Africa. Serge Patrick Manku and Ignatius Anor have the details.
Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to go into recession in 2020. This is due to the coronavirus pandemic, the World Bank warns. It's a first in more than 25 years. In a statement, the Bretton Woods institution said growth forecast is expected to fall sharply from plus 2.4% in 2019 to a range between minus 2.1 and minus 5.1%. The pandemic could likely trigger food insecurity in Africa, the bank noted. Last week, Ghana's finance minister called on China to do more to help ease the debt burden of African economies. The continent is facing a calamity from the coronavirus pandemic. Despite seeing just a fraction of global cases of COVID-19, Africa is already feeling the impact. African economies are expected to contract, putting almost 20 million jobs at risk. African governments are calling for a $100 billion assistance, including support for moratorium on all external debts and eventually some debt write-offs. Last Tuesday, Beijing recognized that developing countries face a greater hurdle. However, it did not mention any specific debt relief measures that would be implemented.
Joining us now is Albert Zufak, the World Bank Chief Economist for Africa, currently in the United States. Mr. Zufak, thank you for joining us on Business Africa.
Thank you, Amel, and a pleasure speaking to you on this program.
Africa is still the lightest hit by the coronavirus. So what are the main factors leading Sub-Saharan Africa into recession as assessed by the World Bank?
We forecast that the per capita gross domestic product will drop from 2.4% in 2019 to negative 2 to 5% in 2020. This is unprecedented. So what explains this severity? There are four extremely important factors behind this recession. The first factor is the decline in world trade and the subsequent drop in commodity prices. The second factor is the decline in financial flows to Africa. The third factor that makes this crisis so severe, Amel, is the health crisis itself. And the last factor is the disruptions that will be caused by the containment measures, the measures that will interrupt the economic activity of people, especially in the informal sector.
Africa has an expected GDP growth of 3.1% and also relies on the strength of raw materials and sectors such as oil and agriculture. Despite these factors, the World Bank still predicts a recession. Why?
I believe that what is extremely important here is to realize that Africa cannot continue to depend on its raw materials as the only strategy for growth or development. The successive crisis that we had in 2016 and now shows that it is important for Africa to resolutely embark on a path of structural transformation to diversify its economy, since the dependence on unprocessed raw materials alone contributes to the fragility of our economies. So what precisely explains this recession that we are planning is that Africa is essentially dependent on these raw materials. But there's also the fact that even before COVID-19 hit these countries, there was already an economic slowdown. The other element that will contribute to the seriousness of this crisis is that in the past, the decline in growth in the three major African economies was very often compensated and even overcompensated by growth in other African countries, not dependent on raw materials.
So what measures can be put in place for large economies such as Nigeria, Angola and South Africa, whose GDPs are expected to drop drastically this year?
Amel, there are two categories of proposals. One, to address the current crisis, and the other general one concerning Africa, which is essentially dependent on raw materials. There is no other option than to start thinking and implementing gradually and naturally as we get out of this COVID-19 crisis strategies of diversification and economic transformation. I believe it is time for Africa to take advantage of the African Union's continental free trade to industrialize Africa seriously. It is for us to add value to our raw materials before we export them and to build intra-African value chains and trade more between African countries so that we can increase the resilience of our economies for future crises.
Well, we have to end that there. Mr. Albert Zufak, thank you so much for joining us on the program, the World Bank's chief economist for Africa, joining us from Washington in the United States.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Join us after the break for details on debt relief for 19 countries to be issued by the International Monetary Fund. Don't go far.